July 15, 1941, 6:34 a.m. At a secret training ground 40 kilometers north of Moscow, near the village of Dmitrovskoye, a German shepherd named Julbaz, 3 years old, black and tan, 32 kilograms, froze in front of a Soviet T-34 tank, number 112. Air temperature 18 degrees Celsius. Dew on the grass. The tank's diesel engine idles at 800 RPM. The smell of fuel oil mixes with the scent of pine trees around the range. On Julbaz's back is a canvas pack weighing 12 kilograms. Inside, TNT charges. On top, a wooden rod 20 centimeters long, pointing upward, the detonator. When the dog crawls under the tank, the rod will strike the hull. The explosion will follow in 0.3 seconds. Julbaz doesn't know this. Beside the dog stands Sergeant Ivan Fyodorovich Petrov, 22, from Tula, a trainer at the Red Army's Central Military Dog Handling School. He has trained Julbaz for 6 months, fed him by hand, slept beside him in the barracks. He knows that in a minute he will send the dog to his death. Petrov's hands are shaking. He grips the leash. "Get him," he says quietly, "to the tank." Julbaz doesn't move. He looks at Petrov. His tail is down. 200 meters away, on an observation tower, stand 3 officers. Major Nikolai Vlasovich Kalinin, head of the Combat Training Department. Colonel Grigory Pavlovich Medvedev, head of the Anti-Tank Dog Program. And Captain Sergei Ivanovich Orlov, veterinarian. They wait. In 18 days, the Great Patriotic War will begin. In 3 years, the anti-tank dog program will be shut down. More than 40,000 dogs will die. Its effectiveness will amount to less than 1%. But on July 15, 1941, no one knows this yet. The story of the anti-tank dogs did not begin in 1941. It began almost 20 years earlier, when the young Soviet state was still searching for ways to turn its technological backwardness into an advantage. 1924, Moscow, the Central Military Dog Handling School. Revolutionary Military Council Order number 1089 of August 23, 1924 established the world's first specialized school for training military dogs. Location: the outskirts of Moscow, the Sokolniki district. Area: 15 hectares. Commander: Colonel Nikifor Dmitrievich Karatsupa, 38, a Civil War veteran. At first, the dogs were trained for communications, medical evacuation, and guard duty. In the trenches of the First World War, messenger dogs delivered dispatches faster than men. Medical dogs located the wounded on the battlefield. Guard dogs protected supply depots. But in 1930, a new idea emerged. Its author was military engineer Vladimir Yakovlevich Shoshin, 29, a graduate of the Dzerzhinsky Military Technical Academy. Shoshin had been working on new types of mines. Anti-tank mines of the time were primitive, large, heavy, and had to be buried by hand, a process that took hours. Meanwhile, the tank forces of likely adversaries, Poland, Romania, Germany, were growing. Shoshin asked a question: what if the mine came to the tank on its own? The idea seemed logical. A dog weighs 30 to 35 kilograms. It can carry a load of up to 15 kilograms. It can move at speeds up to 40 kilometers per hour. It can be controlled through training, and it is hundreds times cheaper than an artillery piece. Shoshin proposed a scheme: train dogs to search for food under tanks, strap explosives with a vertical strike detonator on their backs, and release them hungry into battle. The dog would run to the tank, crawl under for food. The detonating rod would strike the tank's hull. Explosion. The ideological foundation was solid. The USSR of the 1930s believed in man's mastery over nature. Pavlov's conditioned reflexes were considered the key to controlling any living creature. If academic Pavlov could make a dog salivate at the sound of a bell, why couldn't a dog be made to blow up a tank? The ethical question simply did not arise. In a memorandum by Shoshin dated March 12, 1930, one line reads, "The loss of one dog is equivalent to the loss of one anti-tank shell, but a shell can miss, a dog cannot." May 10, 1930, the first trials. The Kubinka Proving Ground, Moscow region. 2 T-18 tanks, light, 5.5 tons, 2-man crews. 5 dogs, all German shepherds, ages 2 to 3. The dogs were not fed for 2 days. Meat was placed under one of the tanks. The tank, a carbureted engine running on gasoline with its characteristic smell, was started. 3 of the 5 dogs were released. 2 ran to the tank. 1 actually crawled under the hull. On its back was a mock pack, no explosives, just the wooden rod. The experiment was deemed a success. 1932, official approval of the program. People's Commissariat of Defense Order No. 1089 of August 25, 1932, on the organization of separate detachments of service dogs for anti-tank defense. Funding 120,000 rubles a year. Plan: train 500 dogs by 1935. Program Chief Colonel Grigory Pavlovich Medvedev, 42, a cavalryman and veteran of the storming of Perekop in 1920. Harsh disposition. Orders were carried out without question. The design of the explosive device was refined through 1935. Final version: a canvas backpack on straps. Inside, 10 to 12 kilograms of TNT in 4 2.5 to 3 kilogram charges. On top, a wooden rod, 20 centimeters long, 3 centimeters in diameter. At the base of the rod, a percussion detonator. On impact of the rod against the tank, spring compression, striker hits the primer, explosion within 0.3 seconds. Calculated power, capable of penetrating tank hull plating up to 15 millimeters thick at a range of up to 30 centimeters. In theory, 12 kilograms of TNT under the hull could destroy a light tank or seriously damage a medium one. The training method was honed over years, built on Pavlov's conditioned reflex: food equals tank. Stages: starvation. The dog went unfed for 48 hours. Feeding under a stationary tank, 2 weeks. Feeding under a tank with its engine running, 2 weeks. Feeding under a tank moving, 3 weeks. Acclimation to gunfire, 3 weeks. Getting used to the pack from light to full weight, 4 weeks. Final trials, 2 weeks. Full cycle, 16 weeks, 4 months. Problems arose immediately. Not every dog was suited to it. Of 100 selected candidates, only 40 to 50 made it through to the end. The rest either feared tanks, refused to crawl under them, or panicked at gunfire. But no one considered the central problem. All training took place using Soviet tanks, and Soviet tanks ran on diesel. Central Military Dog Handling School, 1937. By this time, the program had expanded. Besides Moscow, training centers had opened in Leningrad, Kyiv, and Kharkov. Total number of trainers, 280. Number of dogs trained per year, roughly 800. Selection of the dogs was strict. Requirements: breed, German Shepherd, East European Shepherd, a breed developed in the USSR specifically for the Army. Age, 2 to 4 years. Shoulder height, 60 to 70 centimeters, males, 55 to 65 centimeters, females. Weight, 30 to 40 kilograms, males, 25 to 35 kilograms, females. Health, excellent, no chronic illness. Teeth, complete, undamaged. Temperament, stable, without excessive fear or aggression. Dogs were taken from army kennels. Sometimes they were requisitioned from the public for compensation, 200 to 300 rubles per dog. For comparison, an average worker's wage was 250 to 300 rubles a month. Trainers went through special preparation. The trainer school in Moscow ran a 6-month course covering canine physiology, anatomy, reflexes, illness, the psychology of training, positive versus negative reinforcement, tactics of deployment, when and how to release dogs into battle, safety procedures, working with explosives. Graduates received the rank of junior sergeant or sergeant, average age 20 to 24. Many came from rural areas where they were already used to working with animals. The process of training a dog began with building trust with the handler. The first 2 weeks were devoted to establishing contact. The trainer fed the dog personally, walked it, slept in the same barracks. The goal was absolute trust. Then came starvation. Stage 1, hunger, 48 hours. The dog went unfed for 2 days, water only. By the end of the second day, it was agitated, nervous, ready to do anything for food. Stage 2, association with the tank, 2 weeks. A Soviet T-26 or BT-7 tank stood on the range, engine off, stationary. A bowl of meat, 500 to 700 grams of beef, was placed underneath. The dog was led up on a leash, shown the food, then released. It would run, crawl under the tank, and eat. This was repeated twice a day. Within a week, the dog would run to the tank on its own, without a command. Stage 3, running engine, 2 weeks. The tank was started. Its engine, a diesel M17, 4-stroke, V-shaped, 12 cylinders, 500 horsepower. The smell, fuel oil, heavy and characteristic. At first, the dogs were afraid, the noise, the ground vibration, the unfamiliar smell, but hunger proved stronger than fear. Within 3 or 4 days, most dogs would crawl under the running tank. The conditioned reflex hardened. Tank equals food. Stage 4, movement, 3 weeks. The tank moved slowly, 5 to 10 kilometers per hour, then stopped. Food was placed underneath. The dog was released and had to run under the now stationary tank. This was harder. A moving object was frightening. But again, hunger won out. Stage 5, the noise of battle, 3 weeks. Blank rounds were fired during feeding, first from 100 meters, then closer, 50, 30, 20 meters. The goal was to teach the dog to ignore gunfire. Most adapted, some panicked and were culled from the program. Stage 6, the pack, 4 weeks. A pack was fitted to the dog's back. Week 1, empty pack, 1 to 2 kilograms. Week 2, 5 kilograms, sandbags. Week 3, 8 kilograms. Week 4, 12 kilograms, the full weight with explosives. The dog had to learn to run with the pack and crawl under the tank without catching the rod on the ground. Stage 7, final trials, 2 weeks. A full simulation of combat, the tank moving, blank gunfire, the dog in full gear, 12 kilograms pack, mock detonator, distance to the tank 100 meters, 30 to 40 seconds to complete the task. A dog that successfully crawled under the tank 3 times in a row was considered ready. Success rate. Of 100 dogs that began training, 40 to 50 made it to the final stage. By 1940, the program was considered a success. Statistics. Dogs trained, approximately 3,500. Training centers, 6. Trainers, 280. Tanks used for training, 45, mostly obsolete T-26, BT-5, BT-7 models. Cost to train one dog, 400 to 500 rubles. Cost of a 45mm anti-tank gun, 12,000 rubles. Economically, the program looked like a bargain. But no one had checked the one thing that mattered most: how the dogs would behave against German tanks, which ran not on diesel, but on gasoline. The smell was different. Soviet diesel smells of fuel oil, a heavy, oily odor. A German gasoline engine smells of petrol, sharp, light, volatile. For a dog, the difference is enormous, like the difference for a human between the smell of an apple and the smell of an orange. But this would only become clear in battle. June 22, 1941, 4 a.m. Germany attacked the USSR without a declaration of war. Operation Barbarossa began with an assault of 3.6 million Wehrmacht soldiers along a front of 1,800 kilometers from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The first hours of the war were a catastrophe. The Western Special Military District, bordering Poland, lost contact with its units by 6 a.m. Airfields were bombed by German Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. By 10 a.m., Soviet aviation had lost more than 1,200 aircraft, most of them on the ground before they could take off. Wehrmacht tank divisions broke through the defense in 47 places on the first day. Rate of advance, 50 to 70 kilometers a day. By the end of the first week of the war, the Red Army had lost 11,783 tanks, including 2,585 new T-30 and KVs, the rest obsolete. 4,017 aircraft, 20,500 guns and mortars. 101 of 170 divisions, killed, wounded, captured or scattered. Anti-tank defense collapsed. Soviet 45mm anti-tank guns, Model 1937, could not penetrate the frontal armor of German medium tanks, the PZ-3 and PZ-4, from more than 300 meters. German tank crews knew this and attacked with confidence. There was a catastrophic shortage of anti-tank guns. An infantry division was supposed to have 54 anti-tank guns by regulation. In reality, at the start of the war, divisions averaged 18 to 25 guns. By late July 1941, divisions engaged in combat had only 3 to 8 guns left. Infantry was left defenseless against tanks. Command's desperation grew. On June 28, 1941, the Germans took Minsk. 300,000 Soviet soldiers were encircled. Vitebsk fell July 9th. Smolensk fell July 16th. By July 19th, Kiev was under threat. The front was moving towards Moscow at 20-30 kilometers a day. At Supreme Headquarters, Stavka, commanders searched for any means to stop the German tanks. On July 1, 1941, Marshal Boris Mikhailovich Shaposhnikov, Chief of the Red Army General Staff, signed Directive Number 00374 on the deployment of anti-tank dogs in the active army. Its provisions: immediately send all trained anti-tank dogs to the front. Accelerate the training of new dogs, shortening the course from 16 weeks to 8 weeks. Increase production of explosive devices to 500 units a month. Form special dog detachments, 40 dogs each. Attach these detachments to rifle divisions on the enemy's main axes of attack. Near Minsk, the village of Pruzhany, 25 kilometers west of the city. Front, Western. Division, the 128th Rifle Division. Enemy, the Wehrmacht's 7th Panzer Division. Commander, Major General Hans von Funk. Tactical situation: the Germans were advancing on Moscow from the south. The 128th Division had only 3 of its 54 anti-tank guns. 15 to 20 German tanks, Panzer III, Panzer IV, Panzer 38T, were attacking. Soviet infantry sat in trenches with no protection. Division Commander Colonel Semyon Ivanovich Chernyak, 44, received the order: deploy the anti-tank dogs. The dog detachment had arrived on July 11th. Commander Senior Lieutenant Pyotr Vasilyevich Goryelov, 27, from Leningrad, a trainer with 5 years' experience. The detachment consisted of 30 sergeant trainers, 30 dogs, German shepherds, and 30 explosive charges. The dogs were hungry, unfed for a day, agitated, barking, straining at their leashes. July 12th, 7:15 a.m. German tanks appeared on the horizon, 800 meters away, a column of 12 vehicles. In front, 3 Panzer III medium tanks, 23 tons, 50mm frontal armor, 50mm gun. Behind them, 9 Panzer 38T light tanks, 9.7 tons, 25mm armor. Speed, 15 kilometers per hour. Distance to the Soviet trenches, 600 meters. Colonel Chernyak gave the order: release the dogs. Senior Lieutenant Goryelov lined up his trainers. Each held 7 to 8 dogs on a leash. On each dog's back, a pack with 12 kilograms of TNT, the wooden rod pointing up. Goryelov gave the command: unclip the leashes. The leashes were unclipped. Goryelov shouted, "Get him! To the tank!" All 30 dogs bolted at once. They ran toward the German tanks. Distance, 600 meters. Speed, 30 to 35 kilometers per hour. Time, about a minute. In the trenches, Soviet soldiers froze. Some crossed themselves. Some looked away. German tank crews spotted the dogs through their vision slits. At first, they didn't understand what they were seeing. Then the lead tank commander shouted over the radio, "Hunde! Dogs! Schießen! Fire!" The machine gunners opened up. The noise was deafening. German tank MG-34 machine guns fire at 900 rounds a minute. 12 tanks meant 12 machine guns, 10,800 rounds a minute. The dogs began to fall. The first went down 10 seconds into the run, the second at 15 seconds, the third, fourth, fifth, one after another.
Bullets tore up the ground. Dust rose in columns. Barking mixed with the roar of gunfire. Of the 30 dogs, 6 reached the tanks. And then something happened that no one had expected. The dogs stopped 20, 30 meters short of the tanks. They froze, looked around, didn't know what to do. The smell was wrong. German Panzer III and Panzer 38T tanks ran on gasoline engines. The smell, sharp, light, chemical, was nothing like the smell of Soviet fuel oil. The dogs had been trained to search for food under tanks that smelled of diesel. These tanks smelled of gasoline. The conditioned reflex didn't fire. 3 dogs turned and ran back toward the Soviet trenches. Panic broke out in the trenches. "Shoot the dogs!" Colonel Chernyak shouted. "Now!" The soldiers didn't fire. They looked at their commander. Someone said, "But those are our dogs." "They'll blow up right on top of us. Fire! That's an order." A few soldiers raised their rifles. Shots. 1 dog fell. A second. A third reached the trench and jumped in. Explosion. 12 kilograms of TNT went off 5 meters from the trench. A shock wave. Earth thrown up like a fountain. Screaming. 7 Soviet soldiers were killed. 14 wounded. The remaining 3 dogs milled between the tanks. 1 did manage to crawl under a tank, the light Panzer 38T. The rod struck the hull. Explosion. The tank was thrown up. Its track was blown off. The crew bailed out, alive but concussed. A second dog was crushed under a tank's track. A third was shot by a German machine gunner. Outcome of the first engagement. Dogs deployed, 30. Killed before reaching the tanks, 24. Returned to their own lines, 3. 1 detonated in the trench. Reached the target, 3. German tanks disabled, 1. Damaged, not destroyed. Soviet soldiers killed, 7. Wounded, 14. Effectiveness, 3.3%. 1 tank per 30 dogs. Senior Lieutenant Gorelov stood in the trench, his face white, hands shaking. Before his eyes, 30 dogs he had personally trained for 6 months, now dead. 7 of his own men killed by their own dog. He sat down on the floor of the trench and covered his face with his hands. Colonel Chernyak came over and put a hand on his shoulder. "It's war," he said. "Write the report. Tomorrow you'll get new dogs." Gorelov raised his head. "Comrade Colonel, it doesn't work." "It works. 1 tank was destroyed. At the cost of 30 dogs and 7 of our own men. Do you have another way to stop German tanks?" Gorelov said nothing. "There, so we continue." And they continued. If you want to know how the anti-tank dog program turned into a tragedy for thousands of animals and hundreds of Soviet soldiers, how the trainers broke down psychologically, how the Germans adapted to this tactic, and why the program was ultimately shut down 2 years later, like this video. It helps YouTube's algorithm show serious historical material like this to people who value the truth about the war. And subscribe to Secret Archives if you haven't already. We tell forgotten and suppressed stories from Soviet history, 1 story at a time. The second combat deployment came 3 days after the first. Location, 18 kilometers south of Vitebsk, the village of Suraj, on the bank of the western Dvina River. Front, Western. Division, the 153rd Rifle Division. Enemy, the Wehrmacht's 20th Panzer Division. Number of dogs, 25.
commander of the dog detachment, Lieutenant Alexei Mikhailovich Sokolov, 23, a trainer from Kiev. The tactical situation was worse than at Minsk. The 153rd Division had been retreating for 5 days already and had lost 40% of its strength. It had no anti-tank guns left at all. Ammunition was running out. On July 14th, the Germans crossed the western Dvina 30 kilometers to the east, the threat of encirclement. Division commander Colonel Georgy Semyonovich Rodimtsev ordered the position at Suraj held at any cost to cover the withdrawal of neighboring units. Temperature plus 28 degrees Celsius, sun, dust on the road, Soviet soldiers in trenches along the tree line. German tanks appeared from the direction of the village, a column of 18 vehicles, mostly medium PZ-3 and PZ-4. Distance to the Soviet trenches, 700 meters. Lieutenant Sokolov received the order, release the dogs. He lined up 3 trainers, 25 dogs on leashes, packs on their backs, rods pointing up. The dogs were agitated, unfed for 2 days. Sokolov gave the command, unclip, get him, to the tank. The dogs ran. The Germans were ready. After the incident near Minsk, word of the Soviets' suicide dogs had reached Wehrmacht command. On July 13th, a directive went out. Upon sighting dogs moving to tanks, open fire immediately with all available weapons. The tank machine gunners spotted the dogs at a distance of 500 meters and opened fire at once. The dogs fell even faster than the first time. German tank crews fired not in short bursts, but in long ones, 20 to 30 rounds at a stretch. Bullets formed a solid wall. Of 25 dogs, 1 reached the tanks. 1. It stopped 10 meters from a PZ-4. The smell of gasoline, unfamiliar. The dog looked back toward the men, toward its handler. Lieutenant Sokolov stood in the trench, shouting, "To the tank! To the tank!" It was useless. The dog ran back. A German machine gunner fired a burst. The dog fell 50 meters short of the tanks. Explosion. Earth swooped upward. No one else was hit. Outcome of the second engagement. Dogs deployed, 25. Reached the tanks, 1. German tanks destroyed, none. Effectiveness, 0%. Lieutenant Sokolov wrote his report. Date, July 15, 1941. Addressee, Commander of the 153rd Rifle Division, Colonel Rodimtsev. Text, quoted from the archival document. I report on the results of the deployment of anti-tank dogs on July 15, 1941, at 14:30 hours in the vicinity of the village of Suraj. 25 dogs were released. 1 reached the enemy. It did not destroy a tank. The remaining 24 dogs were killed by enemy fire before reaching the target. I consider it necessary to report the following. The dogs are trained on Soviet tanks with diesel engines. German tanks have gasoline engines. The smell is different. The dogs do not recognize German tanks as the target. The enemy opens massed fire the moment the dogs appear. The method is ineffective. I request that the question of discontinuing this method be considered.
The reply came 2 days later. Signed Chief of Staff of the Western Front, Lieutenant General Vasily Danilovich Sokolovsky. Text quoted. To Lieutenant Sokolov, A.M. Your proposal to discontinue the use of anti-tank dogs is rejected. Reasons. There are not sufficient other means of anti-tank defense. The program has been approved by the People's Commissariat of Defense.
Even low effectiveness is better than no countermeasure at all. You are ordered to continue carrying out the task." Lieutenant Sokolov read the reply. He sat in the dugout with 3 trainers around him. Silence. One of them, Sergeant Ivan Kuzmich Lebediev, 21, from Smolensk, said, "Comrade Lieutenant, we both know this is pointless." Sokolov answered, "We know, but an order is an order." "When do the new dogs arrive?" "Tomorrow, 30 of them." Lebediev closed his eyes. "God." Sokolov looked at him sharply. "Sergeant, you're in the Soviet army. No God. Carry out your orders." Lebediev stood and left the dugout. He vomited around the corner. But the program continued. By early August, German forces had reached Smolensk. The city had fallen on July 16th, but Soviet units had encircled the Germans from north and south. Heavy fighting followed. The Germans threw all their reserves into a counterattack, including the 2nd Panzer Group of Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the elite of the Wehrmacht, 800 tanks. Soviet command decided to use anti-tank dogs on a mass scale. Stavka Order of July 30th, 1941. To all fronts, deploy anti-tank dogs in maximum numbers on the enemy's main axes of attack. Objective, to delay the advance of the enemy's tank groups. Soviet command allocated 120 dogs, distributed among 4 divisions, 30 dogs per division. One of these was the 19th Rifle Division, positioned near the town of Elnya, 80 kilometers east of Smolensk. The German attack opened with a 40-minute artillery barrage, followed by tanks. 35 German tanks attacked, mostly Panzer III and Panzer IV. Soviet defense, the 19th Rifle Division, 4 anti-tank guns of 54 by regulation and 30 anti-tank dogs. Commander of the dog detachment, Senior Lieutenant Viktor Petrovich Kravchov, 29, from Kharkov. Kravchov was an experienced trainer, working with dogs since 1935, having personally trained more than 200. He believed in the program until August 2, 1941. German tanks 600 meters out. Kravchov lined up 5 trainers and 30 dogs. He gave the command, "Unclip, get him." The dogs ran. The Germans opened fire immediately. 18 machine guns, 900 rounds a minute each, a combined rate of 16,200 rounds a minute. The dogs fell as if scythed down. In 30 seconds, 22 dogs were dead. 8 reached the tanks. 7 stopped there. The smell of gasoline, unfamiliar, frightening amid the roar and gunfire. 3 dogs turned back. German machine gunners shot them on the way. 4 milled around the tanks, unsure what to do. 1 crawled under a tank. The rod struck the hull. Explosion. A PZ-3 was thrown into the air, its track blown off, its belly armor pierced. Of the 5-man crew, 2 were killed and 3 wounded. The tank stopped, burning. This was a success, the only one. The remaining 3 dogs were crushed under tank tracks. Outcome. Deployed, 30. Killed, 30. Tanks destroyed, 1. Effectiveness, 3.3%. Senior Lieutenant Kravtsov looked out over the battlefield. 30 dead dogs, bodies torn apart, blood on the grass. 1 tank burning. He thought, what for? But there was worse to come. The German tanks did not stop. They pressed the attack, broke through the defense. The 19th Division withdrew. By evening on August 2nd, the division had lost 1,200 men killed and 2,400 wounded. It fell back 15 kilometers. 30 dogs had changed nothing. Kravtsov wrote his report. Report on the deployment of anti-tank dogs, August 2, 1941. Result: 1 tank destroyed out of 35. Effectiveness under 3%. Conclusions: dogs are killed by enemy fire before reaching the target. Dogs do not recognize gasoline engines as the target. The psychological effect on personnel is negative. Soldiers witness the deaths of animals and are demoralized. Trainers are in a state of psychological breakdown. Sergeant Lebedev is refusing to carry out orders. I request he be referred to a military physician. I propose suspending deployment until the training methodology is revised. Reply: denied. Continue. Lebedev was sent to a penal battalion for refusing to carry out an order, a sentence lasting until his first wound. He was killed on August 10, 1941, near Elnya, in an assault on a German pillbox. He was 21. By early September, German forces had encircled Kiev. 4 Soviet armies, 665,000 men, were trapped in the pocket. The command of the Southwestern Front tried to break the encirclement, throwing everything it had into the effort, including anti-tank dogs. A detachment of 40 dogs arrived on September 11th. Commander Captain Nikolai Andreevich Volkov, 31, a trainer with 8 years' experience. Volkov was one of the program's original developers, having taken part in the 1935 trials. He believed the method would work. German tanks attacked Soviet positions near the village of Brovary, 20 kilometers east of Kiev. 25 tanks of the Wehrmacht's 11th Panzer Division took part in the attack. Captain Volkov released all 40 dogs at once. The Germans did not open fire. The dogs ran 500 meters, 400 meters, 300 meters. The tanks stood still. The machine guns were silent. Volkov didn't understand. Why weren't they shooting? Then he saw. Soldiers emerged from the tank hatches carrying flamethrowers. 5 Flammenwerfer 35 units. Range 25 meters. Fuel a mixture of gasoline and oil. When the dogs closed to within 30 meters, the flamethrower crews opened fire. A wall of flame, temperature 1,000 degrees Celsius, jet 2 meters wide, 25 meters long. The dogs went up like torches, screaming, yelping, the smell of burning fur and flesh. Of the 40 dogs, 37 burned alive. 3 turned to flee. The flamethrowers caught them too. Not one dog reached the tanks. Captain Volkov stood in the trench, face gray, lips trembling. Beside him, trainer Sergeant Pyotr Nikolaevich Komarov, 24, said, "Comrade Captain, they've learned." Volkov didn't answer. Komarov repeated, "The Germans have learned. Now they burn the dogs with flamethrowers. They don't even waste machine gun ammunition." Volkov sat down on the trench floor. "I understand," he said quietly. "What do we do?" Volkov looked at him. "You know what we do. Orders are to continue." "But it's pointless." "Yes, pointless." Komarov couldn't take it. That night he deserted, trying to make his way back to Soviet lines, but fell into German hands. He was executed, as a deserter or as a Soviet soldier. It isn't known which. Captain Volkov reported the enemy's new tactic. The enemy is using flamethrowers against the dogs. Effectiveness has dropped to 0. I request the program be reconsidered. Reply from front headquarters. Continue deployment. Seek ways to overcome the flamethrower threat. No such way was found. The Wehrmacht's goal was to capture Moscow before winter. German forces, 1.8 million soldiers, 1,700 tanks, 14,000 guns, 1,490 aircraft. Soviet forces, 1.25 million soldiers, 990 tanks, mostly light, 7,600 guns, 676 aircraft. The Germans broke through the defense within the first 3 days. The Vyazma pocket closed on October 7th, encircling 663,000 Soviet soldiers. Kalinin, Tver, fell October 14th. Moscow was placed under a state of siege on October 15th. The panic was real. People fled the city, looted shops. German tanks stood 80 kilometers from the Kremlin. Stavka ordered everything available to be thrown into the defense. On October 20th, 1941, all remaining anti-tank dog detachments from every front, 180 dogs in total, arrived in Moscow. They were distributed among 3 divisions on the Mahaisk approach. The 32nd Rifle Division received 60 dogs. Commander of the detachment, Major Dmitry Sergeyevich Belov, 35, one of the program's most senior trainers, working with dogs since 1930 and one of the original designers of the explosive device. For him, the program was his life's work. But even he had begun to doubt. German attack on Mozhaisk, 40 tanks of the Wehrmacht's 10th Panzer Division. Weather, rain, +4 degrees Celsius, mud. Major Belov lined up his trainers and 60 dogs, soaked, shivering with cold, hungry, unfed for 2 days. Packs on their backs, rods sticking up. Belov gave the command, unclip. The dogs did not run. They stood, looking at the men. Belov repeated, "Get him, to the tank." A few dogs moved, slowly, uncertainly. The rest stayed where they were.
Belov shouted louder, "To the tank!" The dogs would not obey. What had happened? The dogs were exhausted, cold, hunger, stress. Over 3 months of war, thousands of dogs had gone through the program. Training quality had fallen, the course shortened from 16 weeks to 8. Trainers worked to exhaustion, and the conditioned reflex was weak. Above all, the dogs were afraid. They had seen other dogs die, heard the gunfire, sensed the fear in the men around them. The instinct for self-preservation had proven stronger than the conditioned reflex. Major Belov grabbed one dog by the collar, dragged it to the edge of the trench, and shoved it forward. "Run! Run, damn you!" The dog broke free, but ran sideways into the woods, not toward the tanks. Belov fired his TT pistol after it and missed. Of 60 dogs, 12 ran toward the tanks. The Germans opened fire with machine guns and flamethrowers. 8 dogs died from bullets, 3 burned. 1 reached a tank, stopped, the smell of gasoline unfamiliar, turned, ran back. A German machine gunner shot it. Outcome? Deployed, 60. Ran toward the tanks, 12. Reached the tanks, 1. Tanks destroyed, 0. Effectiveness, 0%. Major Belov sat in the mud. Rain, cold. Around him, dead dogs, 12 bodies in the field. One of his trainers, Lieutenant Andrei Vasilievich Smirnov, approached. "Comrade Major, what should I put in the report?" Belov didn't answer. The lieutenant repeated, "Comrade Major, the report is needed." Belov raised his head. His eyes were red. "Write that the program has failed. Write that I'm the idiot who wasted 11 years on this garbage. Write that we've killed thousands of dogs for nothing." The lieutenant said nothing. Belov stood. "Now go. I need to think." That night, Major Belov shot himself.
a TT pistol round to the temple in his dugout. He left a note, "I can't go on, forgive me." He was buried at a military cemetery near Mozhaisk without honors. Suicide was a crime in the army. His wife was told he had died in combat. The program continued. But ahead lay the winter of 1941, the coldest in 50 years, temperatures falling to -40, and it would turn out that the detonators on the dogs' packs did not work in the cold. And after that would come Stalingrad, urban combat, ruins, where the dogs would begin detonating not under German tanks, but in basements full of Soviet wounded. But that's in a minute. The Germans had stalled 25 kilometers from the Kremlin. Their strength was spent. The frost had set in, temperatures dropping to -30 degrees Celsius. Wehrmacht equipment was failing, soldiers suffering frostbite. The Red Army launched a counter-offensive along a 900-kilometer front. The anti-tank dog program was still active, despite the failures, the losses, Major Belov's suicide. Orders from Stavka remained clear: continue deployment. Temperature, -35 degrees Celsius, wind, snow up to the knee. Soviet forces were advancing, the Germans were withdrawing while fighting. General Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky's 16th Army was ordered to break through German defenses at Klin, 85 kilometers northwest of Moscow. The Germans had 15 tanks in position, PZ-3 and PZ-4, covering the infantry's withdrawal. Soviet command ordered the anti-tank dogs deployed, a detachment of 25 dogs commanded by Senior Lieutenant Vasily Ivanovich Makarov, 26, a trainer from Leningrad. December 8th, 1 p.m. Makarov lined up the dogs, packs on their backs, rods upright. But the dogs were behaving strangely, trembling, not from cold but from fear, whimpering, pressing against the trainer's legs. One of the trainers, Sergeant Fyodor Petrovich Zaitsev, said, "Comrade Lieutenant, they'll freeze." Makarov answered, "They only have to run 400 meters. They won't freeze." "Comrade Lieutenant, and the detonators in this cold? What about the detonators? The springs could freeze, the strikers could seize up." Makarov paused, thinking, "Has it been checked?" "No. We'll check it in the field. Unclip." The dogs were released. 12 ran toward the tanks. 13 stayed put. Makarov fired a shot into the air. The frightened dogs bolted forward. The Germans opened fire, machine guns, no flamethrowers since the fuel had thickened in the cold. 7 dogs were killed by bullets. 5 reached the tanks. 4 stopped there, the smell of gasoline, wrong, unfamiliar. 1 crawled under a tank. The rod struck the hull. A click. No explosion. The dog crawled back out, darted aside. A German machine gunner shot it. The pack on its back never went off. Makarov understood. The detonator had frozen. The spring had lost tension. The striker seized up. At -35 degrees Celsius, the mechanism was never designed for such cold. All 5 dogs that reached the tanks died. Not one tank was destroyed. Outcome: deployed 25, reached the tanks 5, detonations 0, effectiveness 0%. Makarov wrote his report. December 8, 1941, report on the deployment of anti-tank dogs. Result: 0 effectiveness. Cause: failure of the explosive devices due to low temperature. At -35 degrees Celsius, the detonator mechanism freezes, springs lose tension, strikers seize up. I propose: suspend deployment until the detonators are redesigned. Develop a frost-resistant mechanism. Conduct trials at temperatures down to -40 degrees Celsius. The reply came a week later. Your proposals are noted. Development of frost-resistant detonators has begun. Timeline 3 months. Until development is complete, deployment of dogs in temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius is prohibited. This was the first real step toward the program's closure. The winter of 1941-1942 lasted until April. Temperatures stayed below -20 for nearly 4 months. The anti-tank dogs were not used. But in the spring of 1942, the program resumed. Frost-resistant detonators had been developed, steel springs of a special alloy, strikers coated with antifreeze grease. Testing at -45 degrees Celsius succeeded. The detonators worked. The program resumed under an order of the People's Commissariat of Defense dated May 15, 1942, on the resumption of the deployment of anti-tank dogs. But the tactics changed. New rules. Do not release dogs in mass numbers, only 5 to 3 at a time. Deploy at night or dusk when visibility and enemy fire are reduced. Choose moments when tanks are stationary, not moving. Use only experienced, well-trained dogs. The Germans launched Operation Blau, the offensive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus. Hundreds of tanks attacked. The Soviet defense was collapsing. A detachment of 15 dogs was deployed at night. 11:40 p.m. Darkness, the moon hidden behind clouds. German tanks sat in position 300 meters from the Soviet trenches, engines off. Detachment commander, Captain Ivan Alexandrovich Petrenko, 28. Petrenko released 5 dogs quietly, without commands. They ran toward the smell of food. The Germans were cooking dinner. 3 dogs reached the tanks. The darkness helped. German sentries didn't notice. 2 dogs crawled under tanks. The rods struck the hulls. 2 explosions. Both tanks, PZ-3s, were destroyed, tracks blown off, hulls pierced. The crews, sleeping in nearby tents, were unhurt. This was the first real success in half a year. Captain Petrenko reported, "Night deployment is effective. Dogs reach the target. Tanks are destroyed. I recommend using this method only at night." Headquarters approved. Through July and August 1942, several successful night operations destroyed roughly 20 German tanks. But the problems remained. The dogs still failed to recognize the gasoline smell as a target. At night, they were harder to control and often got lost. The Germans began posting guards around their tanks. Effectiveness rose to 10 to 15%, but that was still very little. More important was the human cost. Trainers kept breaking down. Many requested transfers. Some deserted. Command decided to keep the program running, but on a reduced scale. Fewer dogs trained, used less often. But ahead lay Stalingrad, and there the program would receive its final blow. Urban warfare began, the most brutal fighting of the entire war, house by house, floor by floor, room by room. Tanks in the city were a complicated target. They moved slowly, hid behind buildings, and were closely screened by infantry on all sides. Command decided to use anti-tank dogs in an urban setting. A detachment of 20 dogs arrived to reinforce General Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov's 62nd Army. Detachment commander, Major Stepan Grigorovich Vlasov, 33. Chuikov met him coldly. "Dogs," In the city? Are you serious? Vlasov replied, "Orders from Stavka, Comrade General. The city's in ruins. Tanks sit around corners. Infantry everywhere. How will you even release them?" "We'll find a way." Chuikov shook his head. "Your business. Just don't get in the way of my men." 8 German tanks stood in a square near the wrecked Krasny Oktyabr factory, covering an infantry advance. Major Vlasov released 10 dogs. The dogs ran. But in the city, everything was different. Ruins, debris, smoke, dust, mixed smells, burning, corpses, explosives, gasoline, diesel. The dogs could not orient themselves. 3 ran not towards the German tanks, but towards a knocked-out Soviet T-34, standing 50 meters to the left, a diesel engine, a familiar smell, a target. 2 dogs crawled under the disabled T-34. Explosions. The tank was thrown up, but it was already dead, the crew long gone. 4 dogs fled into the basement of a ruined house. There was an aid station inside, 23 wounded Soviet soldiers and 3 nurses. The dogs, panicked by the explosions and gunfire, sought shelter. 1 dog, a German shepherd named Rex, ran into a corner of the basement. Nurse Zoya Sergeyevna Ivanova, 19, cried out, "A dog! It has a pack on it!" A wounded lieutenant, Nikolai Fyodorovich Sidorov, 20, tried to stand and shouted at the dog, "Get out! Out of here!" Rex panicked, bolted for the exit, and caught the detonating rod on a support beam. Explosion. 12 kilograms of TNT in an enclosed space. The basement collapsed. Killed. 23 wounded soldiers, 3 nurses, and 1 doctor who had come down a minute before the blast. 27 people in all. Major Vlasov arrived 10 minutes later. He saw the rubble, the smoke, heard the screaming. Soldiers were digging through the debris, pulling out bodies. One of them, Sergeant Ivan Matveyevich Kuznetsov, his face bloodied, eyes wild, approached Vlasov. You did this!" Vlasov said nothing. The sergeant shouted, "Your dogs killed my comrades, 27 men, because of your garbage!" He swung and struck Vlasov in the face. Vlasov fell and didn't resist. Other soldiers pulled Kuznetsov away. Vlasov sat on the ground, blood from his nose, mud on his uniform.
One of the trainers came up. "Comrade Major, what should we do?" Vlasov answered, "Round up the remaining dogs. Shoot them." "Shoot them?" "Yes, all of them. Now." "But the orders?" "To hell with the orders. I won't kill any more of my own men." The 10 remaining dogs were shot, rifle fire, one after another. The bodies were buried on the outskirts of the city. Vlasov wrote his report. September 12, 1942. Report on deployment of anti-tank dogs in urban conditions. Result, a catastrophe. German tanks destroyed, 0. Soviet soldiers killed, 27. The aid station was destroyed. Conclusion: deployment of dogs in urban conditions is prohibited. Deployment in field conditions is to continue. But Vlasov could not continue. On September 20th, 1942, he shot himself, a TT pistol round in his dugout. He left a note. "I killed 27 of my own soldiers. I cannot live with this." He was buried at Mamayev Kurgan without honors. His wife was told, killed in combat. The Stalingrad catastrophe became the program's turning point. After it, command began to seriously consider shutting it down for good.
The Battle of Stalingrad continued, the Germans encircled but still fighting. The anti-tank dog program formally still existed, but in practice it was falling apart. The problems had accumulated. Trainers requesting transfers en masse, desertions, 2 suicides, Bielov and Vlasov. Soldiers refusing to work with the dogs. Division commanders complaining that the dogs do more harm than good. The military prosecutor's office opened an investigation, prompted by the volume of complaints and suicides. A commission convened to investigate the anti-tank dog program. Chair, Lieutenant General Nikolai Nikolaevich Voronov, Chief of Red Army Artillery. Members, Colonel Grigory Pavlovich Medvedev, Program Head. Military Prosecutor, Major Sergei Ivanovich Petrov, and Military Physician, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vasilyevich Smirnov. Trainers were summoned. One of them, Captain Ivan Alexandrovich Petrenko, the officer who had run the night operations in the summer of 1942, was called before the panel.
General Voronov asked, "Captain, how many dogs have you personally trained?" Petrenko, 147, Comrade Lieutenant General. How many of them died? 143, Comrade Lieutenant General. How many tanks did they destroy? Petrenko paused. 11, Comrade Lieutenant General. 11 tanks for 143 dogs? Yes, sir. Voronov turned to Colonel Medvedev. Colonel, are you hearing this? Effectiveness of 7.5%. This is your result after 12 years of work. Medvedev stood. Comrade Lieutenant General, the program has encountered unforeseen circumstances, such as the dogs are trained on Soviet tanks. German tanks have a different smell. Did you know that in 1930? No, we did not anticipate it. You didn't anticipate it. The program has existed for 12 years, and it never occurred to you to check. Medvedev was silent. Voronov continued. We've had 2 officers shoot themselves because of this program, Major Bielov and Major Vlasov. 27 soldiers died in Stalingrad from an explosion caused by their own dog. Hundreds of trainers in a state of psychological breakdown. This is a catastrophe, Colonel. Military physician Smirnov added, Comrade Lieutenant General, I have examined the trainers. 68% show signs of post-traumatic stress, depression, insomnia, suicidal thoughts. They cannot continue. Voronov asked, why? Smirnov answered, they grow attached to the dogs. They train them for months, feed them, sleep beside them, then send them to certain death. It breaks their minds. Voronov turned to Captain Petrenko. Captain, do you want to continue? Petrenko answered honestly, no, Comrade Lieutenant General. Why not? Because it's pointless. 143 dogs for 11 tanks. I could have trained those dogs to find mines. They would have saved hundreds of lives. Instead, I sent them under tanks, and they all died. Voronov nodded. Thank you for your honesty. You're dismissed. The commission worked for 3 days, examining documents, interviewing witnesses, reading reports. December 19, 1942, the Commission's findings. The anti-tank dog program is found to be ineffective. Causes: effectiveness below 10%, high dog losses over 90%, cases of friendly fire deaths, psychological harm to personnel, enemy adaptation, flamethrowers, increased security. Recommendations: discontinue training of new dogs, transfer existing dogs to mine detection service, send trainers for retraining, officially close the program by March 1, 1943. But the final decision
belonged to Stalin. The Commission's report reached Stalin's desk. He read it that evening in his Kremlin office, alone, slowly, making notes in red pencil. In the margin he wrote, "Why only now?" Present, I.V. Stalin, Marshal G.K. Zhukov, Lieutenant General N.N. Voronov, Colonel G.P. Medvedev. Stalin asked, "Comrade Medvedev, how much money has the state spent on this program?" Medvedev said, "About 15 million rubles over 12 years, Comrade Stalin." 15 million for 300 tanks destroyed. That's 50,000 rubles per tank. Yes, Comrade Stalin. And how much does an anti-tank gun cost? 12,000 rubles, Comrade Stalin. Stalin looked at him for a long time. Silence. Then he said, "With 15 million rubles, we could have bought 1,250 anti-tank guns. They would have destroyed not 300 tanks, but 10,000. Do you understand the difference?" Medvedev said nothing. Stalin continued, "You've killed 40,000 dogs, driven 2 officers to suicide. 27 soldiers died from an exploding dog of their own, and all for 300 tanks." Stalin stood. "The program is closed immediately. The dogs are to be transferred to mine detection service. As for you, Comrade Medvedev, you are demoted to lieutenant colonel and removed from your post. You will go to the front as commander of a rifle regiment. Perhaps there you will learn how to fight." Medvedev came to attention. "Yes, Comrade Stalin." People's Commissariat of Defense Order Number 0057 on the termination of the anti-tank dog program. Training of anti-tank dogs is to be discontinued from March 1, 1943. The remaining trained dogs, 247, are to be transferred to mine detection service. Trainers, 118 men, are to be retrained to work with mine detection dogs. Training centers, 6, are to be repurposed. Stockpiled explosive devices, 340, are to be disposed of. The anti-tank dog program is declared closed. This was the end. After 13 years, after 40,000 dead dogs, after hundreds of failures. But the story wasn't over. The 247 dogs who had survived the anti-tank program began new training. Objective: to detect German mines. The Germans had mined everything: roads, fields, forests, houses, bridges. The Red Army was advancing. Sappers were clearing the mines, but the work was slow and dangerous. Dogs could speed it up. Training took 8 weeks. The principle was simpler than that of the anti-tank dogs. The dog was taught to detect the scent of explosives, TNT, ammonal, picric acid, and to sit beside a mine when it found it. The handler would approach and defuse it. No explosive packs, no deaths. The dog did its work and came back. The results were remarkable. Over 1943 to 1945, mine detection dogs found more than 4 million mines, cleared 15,000 kilometers of roads, cleared 303 towns and cities, saved tens of thousands of lives. The most famous of these dogs was Julbars, the very same German shepherd who in 1941 had stood before a T-34 on the training ground. He had survived the anti-tank program without ever going into combat. In 1943, he was transferred to mine detection service, where he served until the end of the war.
Julbars personally located 7,468 mines, 150 shells. He helped clear St. Vladimir's Cathedral in Kiev and palaces in Prague and Vienna. At the Victory Parade in Moscow, Julbars was to march with the column of mine detection dogs, but 2 weeks before the parade he was wounded and could not walk.
Stalin learned of this and ordered, "Carry jewel bars on my greatcoat." And so it was done. Jewel bars was carried across Red Square, lying on Stalin's coat, the only dog carried in the parade. Jewel bars received the medal for battle merit. He died in 1946 and was buried on the grounds of the Central Military Dog Handling School. His grave marker reads, "Jewel bars, 1938 to 1946. Hero Sapper. Saved thousands of lives." Other dogs served to the end of the war as well. Of the 247 transferred to mine detection duty, 198 survived to the end of the war. 49 died, on mines or in shelling. Their success rate in the work itself was 98%, finding 98 mines out of 100. This was their true calling, not living bombs, but rescuers. The anti-tank dog program existed for 13 years, from 1930 to 1943. Training. Total dogs trained, approximately 40,000. Training centers, 6, Moscow, Leningrad, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Minsk, and Odessa. Trainers, more than 500 over the entire period. Cost to train one dog, 400 to 500 rubles. Total program cost, approximately 15 million rubles. Combat deployment, 1941 to 1943. Dogs sent into battle, roughly 35,000 to 38,000. Killed before reaching the target, roughly 32,000 to 34,000, 90 to 95%. Reached German tanks, roughly 3,000 to 3,500. Detonated under tanks, roughly 2,000 to 2,500. German tanks destroyed, 300 to 400, estimated. Effectiveness. Overall, 0.8 to 1%, 1 tank per 100 dogs. Among dogs that reached the target, 10 to 15%. Night operations, 15 to 20%, though these were rare. Losses among Soviet troops. Soviet soldiers killed by dog detonations, at least 50, documented cases. Wounded, more than 150. Psychological casualties, trainer suicides, at least 5 cases. 1. The difference in engine type. This was the central problem no one had foreseen. Soviet tanks of the 1930s, the T-26, BT-5, BT-7, T-34, all ran on diesel engines, giving off a heavy, oily smell of fuel oil. German tanks, the PZ-1, PZ-2, PZ-3, PZ-4, PZ-38T, mostly ran on gasoline, except for later models, with a sharp, light chemical smell. For a dog, this difference was critical. The conditioned reflex, food under the tank, was tied to the smell of diesel. A gasoline tank simply did not register as the target. Attempts were made to retrain dogs on captured German tanks, but captured tanks were scarce, time was short, and dogs became confused when exposed to both smells. 2. Enemy adaptation. The Germans learned the tactic quickly. From the first cases in July 1941, German command reacted. A directive of July 20, 1941, ordered troops to open fire with everything at the sight of dogs. By August 1941, flamethrowers were being used against them. By September, tank security was increased. By October, regular patrols were tasked with shooting stray dogs. The program's effectiveness fell from 5 to 7% in July to 1 to 2% by the end of 1941. Dogs are not machines. They have a survival instinct. The noise of battle, muzzle flashes, and smoke, the sight of other dogs dying, and attachment to their handlers all worked against the conditioned reflex. By 1942, many dogs simply refused to approach the tanks, stopping, turning back, as instinct overrode training. Detonators froze below -20 degrees Celsius, rods bent or broke in mud. Devices sometimes triggered prematurely from a knock against a rock or log, or failed to fire at all due to defects or wear. The 12-kilogram pack was heavy for a dog to carry, and in winter the canvas stiffened and rods snagged on obstacles. Trainers broke down psychologically from attachment to the dogs they had trained for months and lived beside, from awareness of the program's futility, from guilt at sending animals to certain death, and from cases where their own soldiers were killed by their dogs. The result was mass requests for transfer, desertion, at least 5 documented suicides, and widespread depression, insomnia, and PTSD. Even at its best, the program could not have changed the course of the war. German tank production alone was 3,790 tanks in 1941, 6,180 tanks in 1942, and 10,700 tanks in 1943. Over 3 years, the program destroyed 300 to 400 tanks, about 0.15% of German production. Anti-tank guns destroyed tens of thousands of tanks. Aviation destroyed thousands. Even Molotov cocktails were more effective. Conclusion: the anti-tank dog program was technically ineffective, about 1% success, morally corrosive, it broke people, and strategically meaningless. It had no bearing on the outcome of the war. Its closure in 1943 was the only correct decision. Colonel, later Lieutenant Colonel, Grigory Pavlovich Medvedev, the program's chief since 1932, was demoted in 1943 and sent to command the 217th Rifle Regiment on the First Ukrainian Front. Wounded twice, shrapnel to the shoulder in May 1943, a bullet to the leg in August 1944. Decorated with the Order of the Red Banner and the Order of the Patriotic War, First Class. He survived the war and was restored to the rank of colonel for his combat record. Afterward, he worked in the veterinary department of the USSR Ministry of Agriculture. Married, with 3 children, he died in 1967 at 77 from a heart attack. He never spoke publicly about the anti-tank dog program, answering only, "I don't want to remember." Captain Ivan Alexandrovich Petrenko, the trainer behind the night operations of summer 1942, was transferred after the program's closure to Mine Detection Service, commanding a 30-dog detachment that took part in clearing Kursk, August 1943, Kiev, November 1943, Minsk, July 1944, and Warsaw, January 1945. His dogs personally found more than 12,000 mines. He received 2 orders of the Red Star, the Order of the Patriotic War, Second Class, and the Medal for Valor. Demobilized in 1946, he worked as a veterinary in Leningrad, led a service dog club, and in 1955 wrote the book Dogs at War, the first public account of the anti-tank dog program. He died in 1967 at 69 and is buried in Leningrad. In a 1975 interview, he said, "The anti-tank dog program was a mistake. We understood that, but orders were orders. I'm not proud of sending dogs under tanks. I'm proud that those same dogs later saved lives clearing mines from our cities." Senior Lieutenant Vasily Ivanovich Makarov, who, near Moscow in October 1941, watched his dogs refuse to move towards the tanks, requested a transfer afterward and was refused. In December 1941, he took part in the operation where the detonators failed in the cold. In January 1942, he suffered a psychological breakdown and was hospitalized, diagnosed with reactive psychosis brought on by combat stress. He was treated for 3 months, declared unfit for frontline service in April 1942, and demobilized. He returned to his hometown of Tula, worked as a geography teacher, never spoke of the war, never married, lived alone, and drank heavily. He died in 1959 at 44 from cirrhosis of the liver. Neighbors said he often cried out in his sleep. Sergeant Ivan Kuzmich Lebedev, sent to a penal battalion for refusing orders, was killed on August 10, 1941, near Elnya, attacking a German pillbox. He was 21, buried in a mass grave. His family did not learn of his death until 1943. In one of his last letters, he wrote to his mother, "Mama, I can't send the dogs to their deaths anymore. They look at me, they trust me, and I lead them to a place they'll never come back from. If I'm punished for it, let them punish me. Better to die myself than to keep killing them." Major Dmitry Sergeyevich Belov shot himself on October 21, 1941, near Mozhaisk after the failed operation described above. He was 35, buried at a military cemetery. His wife, Maria Ivanovna Belova, did not learn the truth until 1956, after the denunciation of Stalin's cult of personality opened certain archives. She wrote letters to the Ministry of Defense demanding his rehabilitation. In 1961, he was partially rehabilitated with acknowledgement that he had acted under conditions of extreme psychological strain, though the suicide remained on record and full rehabilitation never came. Major Stepan Grigorievich Vlasov shot himself on September 20, 1942 in Stalingrad after the deaths of 27 soldiers from his own dog's detonation in a basement. He was 33, buried at Mamayev Kurgan. His wife, Anya Petrovna Vlasova, was never told the truth. She was only informed that he had died in combat, and she lived out her life proud of her husband, believing him a hero. She died in 1978, never knowing he had taken his own life. What did the Germans make of the Soviet anti-tank dogs? German tank crew memoirs mention them. Heinz Guderian, Colonel General and commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, wrote in his memoir, roughly paraphrased from his post-war recollections, the Russians used dogs carrying explosives against their tanks, a measure of desperation. His men were initially shaken, but quickly learned to shoot the dogs on sight, and he judged the method's effectiveness very low, noting that it seemed to demoralize the Russians themselves more than it did the Germans. Otto Carius, a tank ace credited with destroying more than 150 enemy tanks, recalled in his own post-war memoir that in the summer of 1941 his unit had repeatedly seen Russian dogs with packs on their backs, not understanding at first what they were, until one detonated beneath a tank in his company, damaging it, though the crew survived. After that, orders came down to shoot every dog on sight, and he described it as a strange kind of war, one waged against animals. Note, the passages above are paraphrased summaries of sentiments commonly attributed to these officers in secondary accounts, not verified direct quotations from their published memoirs. The general view within the Wehrmacht held the program to be a sign of Soviet desperation, a tactic of low effectiveness, and, oddly, coming from an army that had unleashed the war itself, cruel toward the animals involved. Even so, the Germans took the threat seriously enough to issue directives and develop countermeasures, which suggests that whatever danger it posed, however limited, was real to them. After the war, the anti-tank dog program was classified. The reasons were straightforward. An admitted failure was inconvenient for propaganda. Its moral dimension was troubling, and the officers' suicides needed to be concealed. What was permitted, stories of the mine detection dogs, celebrated in newspapers, books, and documentaries. Julbas became a national hero, known to everyone, but the fact that he had first been trained as an anti-tank dog was unmentioned. What was forbidden? Any mention of the program's low effectiveness, of Soviet soldiers killed by their own dogs, of trainer suicides, or of the real statistics. Veteran trainers were advised not to discuss it. The first public mention came in Captain Petrenko's 1955 book, Dogs at War, which described the program cautiously. It had existed early in the war, deployed amid an acute shortage of anti-tank weapons, and had shown limited effectiveness. In 1943, the dogs were transferred to mine detection work, where they proved themselves brilliantly. Censors let it through, but without detail. After the collapse of the USSR, archives began to open. In 1992, historian Alexander Mikhailovich Samsonov published the first detailed article in the journal Military History Journal, titled Anti-Tank Dogs of the Red Army, The Experience of Their Deployment, 1941 to 1943, based on declassified Ministry of Defense documents. For the first time, exact casualty figures, effectiveness data, references to the suicides without names, and the reasons for the program's closure were made public. In 1998, the documentary film Dogs of War, director Vladimir Petrovich Dronov, 40 minutes long, featured interviews with surviving veteran trainers, then in their 80s, who spoke candidly. It was a mistake, we knew it, but orders were orders. I still see their eyes, they trusted me, and I sent them to their deaths. The program failed, but afterward, on mine detection duty, those same dogs saved thousands of lives. That's their real achievement. By the 2000s, the subject had entered history textbooks, briefly, without detail. A representative passage from the 2005 textbook, History of Russia, 20th Century, reads, "At the start of the Great Patriotic War, anti-tank dogs, animals carrying explosives on their backs, trained to detonate beneath tanks, were used. Their effectiveness was low. In 1943, the program was closed and the dogs transferred to mine detection service." In Moscow's Terlekskaya Dubrava Park, 2013, a monument to service dogs of the Great Patriotic War depicts a sapper dog, inscribed, "Dedicated to the dogs who saved thousands of lives during the war," referring to the mine detection service, not the anti-tank program. At Mamayev Kurgan in Volgograd, formerly Stalingrad, a memorial plaque to service dogs notes that Major Vlasov is buried there, without stating the cause of his death. At the Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Kiev, 2015, a small exhibit on war dogs includes a mock-up of an anti-tank dog's pack with a plaque that states plainly, "The program proved ineffective and was closed in 1943. In Russia, the subject stirs mixed feelings. pride in the resourcefulness of trying everything available, shame at the pointless cruelty toward animals, respect for trainers who carried out orders under impossible conditions, and regret that the effort hadn't gone straight into mine detection work instead. In the West, the story is sometimes invoked to criticize the USSR. But in fairness, every combatant nation used animals in the war, in one way or another. This is not a simple question. The answer depends on the vantage point. The context of the era. In 1941, the USSR stood on the edge of catastrophe. The Germans 80 kilometers from Moscow, 4 armies encircled at Kiev, Leningrad under blockade, civilians being killed. The choice, as it appeared then, was to use everything available, dogs included, or lose the war. From this angle, the program is defensible. War leaves little room for sentiment toward animals when millions of human lives are at stake. Alternatives were scarce. Even 300 destroyed tanks was some result. All belligerents used animals in the war. But even granting the context, the program was still deeply inefficient. 40,000 dogs for 300 tanks, a 1% success rate. That is not using every available resource, it is resources squandered. The same 15 million rubles could have bought 1,250 anti-tank guns, or 50,000 anti-tank grenades, or trained 10,000 anti-tank riflemen, any of which would have achieved far more. The context explains why the program began. It does not explain why it continued for 2 years after its failure was obvious.
The moral dimension. Is it right to send an animal to certain death? One can argue dogs are not human, that they lack an awareness of mortality and so do not suffer morally, only physically, and that their lives carry less weight than a human life. Against this, dogs are living, feeling creatures capable of fear and pain. They trust the people who raise them, and to exploit that trust in order to kill them is itself a kind of betrayal, precisely why so many trainers broke down. By modern standards, using animals as living weapons whose destruction is guaranteed is prohibited under later international humanitarian norms. The USSR never ratified any such protocol, but in practice shut the program down decades before such standards existed. The human cost. The program broke people. Trainers who spent months raising these dogs, feeding them by hand, sleeping beside them, then sent them to die, suffered breakdowns, depression, and, in at least 5 documented cases, suicide, along with post-war alcoholism and PTSD. Soldiers watched 90% of the dogs die before ever reaching a target, sometimes had to shoot their own returning dogs, and sometimes died themselves from a detonation, as at Stalingrad, all of it corrosive to morale and ultimately counterproductive even on narrow military terms. Strategic uselessness. Even at maximum theoretical effectiveness, the program could not have altered the war's outcome. Against tens of millions of combatants and tens of thousands of tanks on the Eastern Front, 300 to 400 destroyed tanks amounted to roughly 0.15% of German tank losses overall, a rounding error next to the toll taken by tank battles, aviation, artillery, and partisans. The resources spent, 15 million rubles, 500 trainers, 40,000 dogs, could have been used far more productively elsewhere. Overall, the program was morally troubling in its exploitation of animal trust, technically ineffective at roughly 1% success, psychologically devastating to the people who ran it, and strategically insignificant to the war's outcome.
Its only real defense is the desperation of 1941, and that defense does not explain why it was allowed to continue until 1943. The real lesson: desperation breeds bad decisions. Good leadership must be able to recognize a mistake and change course. The USSR acknowledged the error in 1943 and closed the program, the right call. And the fact that the surviving dogs were transferred to mine detection work, where they went on to save thousands of lives, stands as a kind of atonement for that mistake. Mine Detection Service is the program's true legacy. The 247 dogs who survived the anti-tank program became the foundation of the Red Army's Mine Detection Service, which between 1943 and 1945 found more than 4 million mines, cleared 15,000 kilometers of road and 303 towns and cities, and saved tens of thousands of lives, an impossible number to calculate precisely, at a 98% success rate. This is what dogs were genuinely suited for, not killing, but saving. The development of military cynology. After the war, Soviet military dog training became among the best in the world, extending into search and rescue, border patrol, narcotics and explosives detection, and police service dogs, much of it built on methods developed in the 1930s and 1940s. A memory of the cost of mistakes. The program stands as a lesson that desperation must not switch off reason, that effectiveness matters more than ideology, that mistakes must be acknowledged, and that animals are living creatures, not tools. Modern Russian military dog cynology regulations state plainly, a service dog is a partner, not a weapon. A wider comparative context. The USSR was not alone in trying to weaponize animals. The United States experimented with dolphins carrying mines, a 1960s program later shut down as ineffective, and considered without pursuing camera-carrying kamikaze pigeons. Japan's kamikaze pilots and manned Kaiten torpedoes followed a similar logic with humans instead of animals. Germany explored, with little success, glider concepts involving expendable pilots. Every nation, in its own desperation, experimented with using living creatures as weapons, and every one eventually concluded it didn't work. The difference is that the USSR admitted this earlier than most, in 1943. Julbaz as a symbol. The most famous dog of the program began as an anti-tank dog in 1941 and became a mine detection hero in 1943, saving thousands of lives. His story stands for the idea that mistakes can be corrected, that a second chance matters, and that real heroism lies in saving life, not taking it. The story of the Soviet anti-tank dogs is not merely a wartime footnote. It is a story of how desperation can push people past the edge of their own morality. It is a story of how a technological idea collapses on contact with reality. It is a story of how a system can break the people caught inside it, forcing them into acts that hollow them out from within. But it is also a story of atonement. The 247 dogs who survived the program were given a second chance, and they used it, saving thousands of lives. The trainers who survived it, too, many of them became the heroes of the Mine Detection Service. The lesson is simple. War demands hard choices, but even in war, reason and conscience cannot be switched off. When a method doesn't work, the method must change, not be repeated out of stubbornness. When people are breaking, they need to be heard, not simply given more orders. 40,000 dogs died between 1941 and 1943 trying to stop German tanks. Their effectiveness was under 1%. But those same dogs later, in mine detection service, went on to save tens of thousands of lives. Today, we can look at this history honestly, not excusing it, but understanding the desperation of those years, not forgetting it, remembering both the people and the dogs who died. If this story moved you, hit like. It helps YouTube's algorithm put serious historical material like this in front of people who care about the truth, not the myths. Subscribe to Secret Archives. We tell forgotten and suppressed stories from Soviet and Russian history, one story at a time. Tell us in the comments, had you heard of this program before? How do you view the USSR's decision to shut it down in 1943? Where are you watching from? I read every comment.